Hello, this is S.K. Williams, and today I would like to talk to you about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is perhaps the most famous detective to have ever lived, and certainly one of the most famous private detectives to have ever lived, if not the most famous. This is a rather impressive feat, considering he is a fictional character. Yet, he did live, and even his address is famous, 221B Baker Street, London, England, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. And to honor that, this is the 221st video I have produced for this channel, unless you are watching this on Minds, or perhaps on a channel that I don't yet have at the making of this video, but do in the future. Regardless, it is the 221st video I posted on YouTube, and the 221st video I posted on BitChute. And it is about Sherlock Holmes. It's really just a bit of a praise video, though. I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes adventures, and I read all of them. I also watched the Granada television Sherlock Holmes adaptation, and several Sherlock Holmes movies. He was always more of a childhood hero of mine. I've always preferred the intellectual over the action hero. My favorite character in Star Wars, for example, was Yoda, the wise mentor, and Holmes always solved his problems using deductive reasoning and logic, which I've always loved. And I know the atheist community says that's impossible since I'm religious, and religious people don't think with logic, and atheists are logical, blah 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 blah. Go ahead if you want to watch my channel, see that I've done religion videos, and then make that kind of comment. It's rather trite at this point. Anyway, back to Sherlock Holmes. Holmes was in over 60 canonical adventures, by which we mean those written by Arthur Conan Doyle, and is now in the public domain. This means, of course, that anyone may use the character any way they like, and it means that I don't have to worry when I speak about him of any sort of content strike. Not that reviews usually get that, but companies have been a bit persnickety of late. At any rate, it's harder to tell what is and is not an authentic Holmes story these days because Holmes belongs to everyone, but in general we tend to think of the canonical stories as those written by Arthur Conan Doyle. At any rate, there are some interesting pieces of trivia that I can tell you about Holmes. One of which is that Holmes was inspired by several characters, some fictional, some real, such as Augustine Dupin, a character from Edgar Allan Poe's work. He was generally acknowledged as the first detective in modern fiction, at least the modern style of detective, and of course did have a bit of an influence on Holmes himself. But Holmes was also based heavily on a real person, a Dr. Joseph Bell, who was a surgeon and lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, and whom Arthur Conan Doyle had known personally and worked for as a clerk. Bell was well known for his keen observation skills and deductive logic and reason, traits Holmes himself is also famous for. On a side note, the character of House on the TV show House was inspired by Sherlock Holmes, but was made into a doctor because of this connection, because Joseph Bell had been a surgeon and had been the inspiration of Holmes. I never liked House, even though I liked Sherlock Holmes, but that's another matter. It is still nonetheless an interesting thing, because House is in some ways the progeny of Sherlock Holmes. Other inspirations were also another surgeon at the university, Sir Henry Littlejohn. He was the chair of medical jurisprudence at the University of Edinburgh Medical School, which is also where Joseph Bell had been a surgeon. He is also cited as an inspiration for Holmes because he put into the mind of a young and impressionable Arthur Conan Doyle the link between a medical examination and law enforcement, a sort of basic forensics for its time, if you will. And of course, Henry Littlejohn was also very well known amongst the police department for his skill in his own deductive and observational talents. It is also possible that Maximilien Hélard, which was written by a French author, Henry Chauvin, was also possibly an inspiration on Holmes, but this is contested. Holmes is also rather famous for his eccentric personality, which is odd considering that Arthur Conan Doyle, his creator, gave him this personality so that the audience would not relate to him or particularly like him and focus on a part of the story that was most important, the mystery. But Holmes was such an eccentric that his personality drew people in. He was so unusual that he was fascinating, and his flair for showmanship, something useful in a story to make it interesting, also brought people to delight in his adventures. Holmes is also rather famous for his partnership with Dr. John Watson, who is often depicted in other media as a bumbling idiot, but who was in fact a highly intelligent doctor and skilled army physician. He was perhaps not as observant or skilled at deductive logic as Holmes, but very few are. And Holmes was himself not very good at normal things that normal people did. So their partnership allowed for Holmes to have a better grasp on normal people and provided him a bit of medical forensics, since Holmes was not particularly skilled in that regard, in spite of Holmes actually being skilled and talented in other ways. In fact, Sherlock Holmes was rather singular in his pursuits. His knowledge and skills consisted of mostly that which was useful in his profession. For instance, he had a knowledge of anatomy which was accurate, but not particularly in depth. But he had a profound knowledge of chemistry, detailed with perhaps a doctorate level, a mastery of it, as you will. He had a fair skill at the violin, but with that it was middle ground, neither great like a virtuoso, nor poor, just average. He was, however, good at self-defense, knowing how to stick fight, how to box, how to use a sword. He also had a very good working knowledge of British law. But he wasn't very well aware of things like literature, culture, art, philosophy, astronomy. He knew near nothing about any of these and had a very basic understanding of politics. He did, however, have an interest in botany, but he didn't actually know much about growing a practical garden. Most of his knowledge of botany came from the fact that various plants can be used to make drugs or poisons. But he still knew about them, and he knew a great deal about soil, but not necessarily about geography. Most of what he enjoyed focusing on was dedicated to his deductive and logical skills. As such, he was also rather good at mathematics. Holmes was, however, well aware of certain things. When he spoke, he would make allusions to Shakespeare or to Goethe, and he would often lace what he said with biblical references. Holmes was likely a Christian, although of what sort is unknown, given the time period he was in, probably Church of England, especially given that his family background was supposed to be of the gentry. But this is speculation. But he did recognize a few things. He recognized the works of Martin Knoller and Joshua Reynolds, for example. Though this is a bit out of character considering that he doesn't know much about literature, though perhaps he had read those. Holmes was a very interesting man whose most famous trait was his deductive logic. Though, to be honest, a lot of his deductive logic was inference rather than actual deduction. Nevertheless, this was a defining trait of Sherlock Holmes. His ability to act as a logician and to notice small details that, connecting together, would reveal to him the reality of the situation. Holmes also defined the modern detective genre, as many stories began following the formula laid out in Holmes. And he's also inspired other characters. I've already mentioned Gregory House from House. I just remembered his first name. But he also inspired a Star Wars character in the old expanded universe, which is now called Legends since Disney purchased it. And that would be Grand Admiral Thrawn, a character that Disney hence actually brought into the new Disney canon because he was so good. He is a This alien, but hey, he's based on Holmes with his deductive logic. Sherlock Holmes was always someone that I admired when I was younger for his ability to figure things out and his stubborn intellectual talents. He didn't really care about what society thought of him, and he didn't really win the day by fighting the villain. In fact, Holmes, while he could fight to defend himself, rarely resorted to physical violence to resolve his issues. Well, that's about all I need to say about him for now. I may make another video in the future when I become more practiced. These videos that I make aren't necessarily very good, but they are improving. My videos now are better than those in the past, so I'm hoping that in a year or two I'm rather skilled at this. As such, perhaps this is the violin that I shall play as Holmes played his. I shall sign off now. Thank you. God bless, and goodbye.